Hi, my name is Emily. I am a London-based knitter, and this is another knitting podcast. So firstly, I just want to start off with a major caveat. Feel free to watch this video on 2 times the speed. Today I have 1 finished object and 4 whips for various reasons, and we'll get on to those reasons later on. But I've got a whole heck of a lot of material to cover. And I do just want to say, thank you to such strong, at least I think it's really strong, and encouraging discourse. And I just really like being a part of the long format knitting community. It's been really lovely. And I think it comes as no surprise to anyone, but what I love about knitting is a lot of the technical aspects. And it's just really lovely to see that folks have kind of that shared desire to want to, learn a little bit more about different techniques, etc., beyond just a pattern review or a pattern roundup. And I don't think you'll be seeing any pattern roundups from me anytime soon. But in any case, yeah, I've got a lot to share. I've recorded this video about 4 times, but it's really difficult to speak to the degree of, specificity that I want to get at. So it'd be really helping me out if you guys could, as you're watching this video, just have a think. Can you give me some advice as I hopefully continue to make more? But when should I kind of dig into the technical bits? Like, do you want to see them as they go when they're in whip format? Or is it nicer for you to kind of hear the summary top to tail once they're finished objects? Keep that in mind. I'll definitely take some advice. As long as you'll provide it, I'm more than happy to take it. But with that being said, thank you so much once again for that engagement. It's definitely what's keeping me going because, gosh, it's taken me ages to make this because recording content and editing content is not in my wheelhouse. But without further ado, let me just dive into the first finished object. This is the first finished object. It is the Agnete Cardigan or Agnete Cardigan by PetiteKnit, and it is knit up in a 100% British alpaca. It is not a Surrey alpaca, and Surrey tends to be, yarn or fibers from a more juvenile alpaca. These pet alpacas were probably very old when they were sheared. It's a very rustic yarn, but moreover, it's very drapey yarn, and a better synonym for drapey that I'd like to use is that it's just very heavy. So from a gram perspective, it's just so weighty. So as you can see, it has this really, it just falls. And I'd just like to highlight a few things about this garment. So firstly, this is an entirely brioche knit cardigan. And the very first tip that I want to share is that I think if this is your first brioche pattern, it wouldn't be a bad thing. However, I don't think it should be your first cardigan pattern. And going back to the brioche piece, if you are knitting brioche for the first time or you want to broach brioche for the first time, you probably are familiar with this, but brioche is a 2-row repeat. And so the reason why I recommend knitting a cardigan in a brioche pattern first or a scarf is because knitting brioche flat is a lot easier, I believe, for beginner knitters or knitters who've never knit brioche than in the round. And this is because when you knit brioche flat, you are going to be knitting knit stitches more often. Versus when you knit brioche in the round, your first stitch, your first row might be that alternating knit, purl. However, your second row, it's going to be predominantly purl stitches. So just something to be to be mindful of. And this is all to say, I love this end garment. I think there are other really similar patterns out there, including one by Kotoba Kika. Brioche cardigans, there's just a real sophistication to it in my mind, just because from far away it looks like a rib, but up close you can really see the complexity of those strands that come through. And this is all to say that even as a beginner, someone who's never knit brioche before, you can also take on a cardigan pattern with enough patience. With patience being the key word, because brioche grows at a significantly slower rate, so just kind of buckle up and get ready for the long haul. But that being said, this is my encouragement to you, take that leap of faith and just go for it. I do want to kind of caution you though, however, in that this pattern should not be your first cardigan pattern. And that is because when you knit this pattern, you are knitting the button band simultaneously. And so if you've never knit a cardigan before and you don't really know the proportions of what you want, it might get difficult when you get down to the buttonhole openings to basically, excuse me, to basically have the confidence in terms of where to place those buttonholes. So as a result, it may require you to frog, or if you're happy with kind of going with the flow, just having a few wonky spacings between your buttonholes. But that brings me to another point that I'd like to talk about, in that this is also a really great pattern because I think Petite is an excellent designer when it comes to really refined construction. This is another great pattern showcasing that. So if you've never actually knit a double knit button band, I actually think that this might be an excellent first candidate. Now, the reason why I say that is because typically, if you just kind of think back to your very first project, when you're first taking on a new technique, such as even just knitting in the round for your first hat, I'm just making things up, but you'll find that the consistency and the quality of your techniques and the application of your techniques just improves over time. So probably the start of your hat's a little bit wonky, and within the same project, you're noticing that your tension is getting a lot more even. And the same will probably hold true, especially when you're thinking about a double knit button band. It is a bit fiddly, but because you are basically practicing that technique from inception as you go through the garment, the place whereby you're really learning is in the back neck area. No one looks at your back neck really, unless they're, your partner or weirdo. But that aside, you can really have and build that familiarity with the technique in those sort of low risk areas. And then by the time you get to places that are more visual on the garment, hopefully, or visible on the garment, hopefully you'll build that confidence and that consistency of that technique. And yeah, I think it's just a great way of doing it. Also, it does save yourself the burden at the very end of your project when you have to overcome that mental burden of saying, I basically knit up my whole garment. Darn, now I gotta go back and do the finishing. A lot of times it's that mental hill to climb that a lot of folks just kind of tap out with. So I would actually argue it's really great because brioche is a 2-row repeat. It's really great that you're able to knit the double knit button band alongside that brioche 2-row repeat. So point there. The other place where I'd like to kind of point out, just be a little bit cautious, and perhaps now is the right time to kind of pause and just give an overview of the construction because it does affect what I'm about to say next. So the way that this is constructed is you begin with the back trapezoidal back panel here. This trapezoid shape is created using brioche increases. Ooh, that's another point actually. Especially for brioche beginners, you actually start implementing the brioche increase quite early on, which is a good thing in my mind because you're able to interact with that technique. If it's not to your liking, who cares? You're just gonna frog 2 inches of your work rather than a whole darn garment. So another point for, feel free to knit a cardigan when you're first knitting brioche. But anyway, getting back to the construction, you first knit the back panel, you create the trapezoid shape with increases. Once you have created a sufficient amount of that back panel, basically all the way to the end of the armhole, you then pick up along the back for your left front and right front. And then once that has been knit up to a sufficiently long enough, length to the end of the armhole, basically, you'll join the left panel into the back panel into the right panel to create one piece knit flat. And then ultimately, once you get to the bottom of the cardigan, you're also making a series of increases to create the V-neck, but you essentially knit all the way to the end of the cardigan, noting that the cardigan is, finished with a transition from brioche into 1x1 rib, hence the reason why it cinches in ever so slightly. And then once you're finished with the body, or whatever order you choose, really, it's kind of your own knitting project, so you can do whatever. You then pick up for the sleeves, which brings me on to the next segment of what I want to talk about. And that is the sleeve here. I think from a design perspective, PetiteKnit has really done a great job of thinking about how the sleeve intersects with the both back and front panel. So as you can see here, the brioche is just a natural, there's a brioche knit rib here, followed by a brioche purl ridge there, and so on and so forth, creating that, you know, really lovely plush fabric. The place where you pick up for the sleeve, it's effectively at the end of a purl, and because the way you pick up stitches naturally, it almost protrudes, it makes the sleeve stitches that you've picked up protrude out. So it's almost this really natural, you know, continuation of that foreground knit, background purl. My tip for you guys is that when you are picking up a brioche sleeve, you try to aim to pick up every brioche stitch. And what I mean by brioche stitch is that, as I've mentioned multiple times before, brioche is a 2-row repeat. So as a result of those 2 rows, you're actually knitting 1 row of brioche stitch. So try to pick up in every single one of those brioche stitches that is created. What happens is you're probably, most of the time, I hear a lot of times that folks don't love picking up stitches for sleeves. It's their least favorite. So they kind of go about things a little bit willy-nilly. But I do have to say, I think what the beauty of brioche is that plushness. And so therefore my recommendation by picking up every single brioche, it's probably going to result in you picking up more stitches than you think you need. And the reason why I say that is because it will actually, in my mind, reduce the amount of holes that you create in your garment. And so that's simply because the foundational row for brioche is entirely knit. And then you go ahead and you create in your second row that sort of threaded pattern that brioche is known for. But because there's no brioche stitch immediately below, that thread creates gapping. And so when you don't have a brioche underneath, because you're basically picking up those stitches there, you compensate for those potential holes with the density of the amount of stitches you pick up. Furthermore, the reason why I recommend a higher density is because if you picked up fewer stitches, you would be stretching out the brioche. And I think the beauty of a brioche is that plushness. So why stretch it out by picking up fewer stitches? Pick up more stitches, and then it just lands and relaxes in so much nicer of a way, at least in my opinion. The other place to be mindful of is, when I mentioned that construction technique, is that this back panel is essentially joined to the front panel, and it effectively looks like this before you even attach the sleeve on. When you are thinking about the sleeve stitch pickups, please try to pick up a stitch right in here. As close to the gap as you possibly can. Maybe that even means going into a stitch, which no one will notice. And the reason why I recommend that is because if you fail to pick up that stitch right there at the apex of where those 2 panels join together, you're gonna get a hole, and it's gonna be glaringly obvious. So it's almost better to over pick up than under pick up, because no one's really gonna see the density of the stitches. They're gonna see the absence of the stitches, if that makes sense. And then the other place to be mindful of, and Petite does a great job of doing this because the amount of stitches she recommends you cast on when you're joining the front and the back panel together is the appropriate amount in my mind, because it allows you to continue the brioche ridges. So when you are picking up the sleeves, please also be mindful by counting even odd to make sure that if you want to have this sort of finish, that you can achieve it. And that is to say, if you notice, this ridge of brioche knits continues seamlessly into the body there. So something else to be mindful of. So effectively, with the sleeves, to summarize it, there are 3 things to look out for. Number 1, pick up the stitch at the apex of where the front panel and the back panel meet. Number 2, pick up more stitches than you think you need. I recommend 1 picked up stitch for every brioche stitch. So 1 stitch for every 2 natural rows. And then finally, when you are picking up, just be mindful of your odd and even pickups, so that if you wanted the desired effect of a continued knit ridge, you can achieve it. And there you go. And then the last thing that I want to mention, and please know, all of this has been knit up to PetiteKnit's pattern, insofar as, I haven't changed anything about the construction. Sure, I may have changed, you know, which of the sizes I've followed, given that my yarn tension, or excuse me, my yarn gauge was very different. I think it was. I don't actually recall. But my yarn gauge knit on 3.75 needles, I believe, was slightly different than the gauge that she recommended. So all that to say, I basically made no modifications. These are just sort of, hey, think about this when you approach this part of the pattern. The only slight change that I made was when you get to this portion down here. As I mentioned, you transition, or PetiteKnit has you transition from a brioche stitch into a 1x1. So because the 1x1 rib is now just a 1-row repeat, you can't really do, I tried. If someone figured it out, hats off to them, feel free to let me know. But I tried to figure out a mechanism in which I can still continue to knit the double knit button band at the same time while I'm knitting the knit purl sequence. I just couldn't figure it out. So all that is to say, at some point, these 2 points deviate. And what I recommend you do, and it is written up in my Ravelry, albeit I don't know how clear it is, but I just recommend that the moment you transition to that 1x1 rib, you cast on an extra stitch at both ends. Now what this does is it basically gives you 1 additional stitch, so you can continue this purl ridge all the way down from, as you can see here, there's almost like a really nice brioche ridge, trough here. And I basically, because I was able to add that 1 extra stitch, I continue the purls of my 1x1 rib through, so that from a design perspective, that line continues all the way through the cardigan. I just think it adds that like little refined touch. Just something for you to think about, because it's super easy to toss in. I mean, you don't even, I think I ended up writing a saga, and at the end of the day, the advice is just cast on 1 stitch on either side, and you purl those stitches whenever you get there, etc., etc. Yeah, I think it just makes for a really professional, albeit I think commercial looking garment, but you guys can choose to disagree. And then the last point I think has been mentioned by other folks, I'll just glaze over it really quickly. When you are making your buttonholes, if you don't want to break your yarn, PetiteKnit actually has a tutorial related to the November jacket. And so that was really helpful, especially if you were like me, playing a very dangerous game of yarn chicken where you want to, knit with as much yarn and salvage as much yarn as possible. So overall, in the end, I would say I was mostly happy with this garment, and for whatever reasons, when I reached kind of like low points in this garment, it wasn't because of the pattern, it wasn't because of like the yarn, it was simply because I had lost at yarn chicken. So in total, I have knit the body 3 times and then the sleeves twice. And that's simply because I lost yarn chicken, so I needed to steal from the body to give to the sleeves. But because I mentioned you're knitting your button band together at the same time as the body, that also meant that I had to frog all the way up to the V-neck because it changed the spacing between my buttonholes. I couldn't just shorten it because that made some of the button placements a little bit weird. And let me just think. Technically, this isn't a fully finished object because I haven't yet found the right buttons I want for it, but I'm not really putting any stress on it just because I really enjoy wearing the cardigan open. So I've worn this a few times, and after I've worn it a sufficient number of times to give you a sense of the pill profile, etc., the shedding, I'll report back and see how it goes. And if I can finish off, I did actually forget one other modification, and it's a really minor modification, but it's one to be wary of. So quite common in a lot of the Ravelry projects, they mention that the sleeves are very tight. I concur with this. The reason why I had to re-knit my entire sleeve, because one would be like, hey, you could just continue the sleeve length. The reason why I re-knit the entire sleeve is because I had knit according to the pattern decrease sequence. Yep, I scrapped the decrease sequence. Ultimately, this sleeve that you see here, it is just a single tube. There are no decreases. In fact, if you see what looks like a bubble sleeve at the very end, this is not created by any decreasing whatsoever. It's just created by the transition from brioche into 1x1 rib, albeit I did size down to get an even more dramatic cinch. And yeah, this is it. And giving you my final thoughts, I think the one other thing that I want to mention before I close out, and I'm just going to kind of whip this to give you a sense of, actually it's probably not giving you a really good sense of what it looks like on the body, because this is a sweater and I usually don't put sweaters under it, but hopefully you can kind of take a preview. It's really fluffy, it's really heavy, and that's kind of my last little tip. Yes, that was my last little tip. For any folks who are looking to replace yarn, you should definitely be looking at the meterage, because a lot of times the meterage doesn't lie, so you kind of can circle back to that by looking at other Ravelry projects. But when you have a sense of how much meterage you're going to use, it doesn't have to be exact, put your yarn bowls in a bag and just lift the bag. Had I done this for this sweater, I don't know if I would have, you know, continued to knit with this yarn per se, just because it's a really heavy garment. Now, it all ended up just fine in the end, because I think for the heft of this yarn, it's really suitable for something like a cardigan, like an outerwear piece like this, like a jacket, you know. So this is more like a jacket rather than a cardigan for me. But just kind of do that step, because sometimes I have one project that's just in hibernation. It is just so darn heavy. I just stopped. I was like, I'm never gonna wear this sweater because it was a turtleneck and it was so heavy on my body. It just wouldn't be comfortable. So just a little tip, especially if you're starting to think about yarn replacement, or even if you're not replacing the yarn, just do that and then you'll kind of get a little bit more confident that the end product is going to be what you wanted and what you envisaged. So yeah, this is the Agnete cardigan and I'm quite happy with it. So the first whip I have to talk about is a continuation from last video, and that is the Moby sweater. I think I spoke at, oops, that is my stopper on my C-knit needles, it just bounced that way. I think I talked at length about the yarn in last video, because I had a little segment called like a swatch review or a Q review, where I kind of show you a swatch and try to pick out the next pattern based on the qualities of that swatch. And so just as a recap, this yarn is, it is the Fibre Co. Oops Blend #1. And it is a really, it's just a yarn with the weirdest yarn composition. There's just like everything in this yarn. And it makes for just a really interesting texture. And I talked at length about the actual yarn quality itself, and it's because the yarn is twisted in such a way that each strand had its own texture. So I was toying, at the time I was toying between two types of garments. One, an entirely stockinette garment, where I let the texture of the yarn speak and sing for itself. Or in the other camp, I almost pick an overly textured garment so that the texture of the garment would basically overshadow the texture of the yarn itself. And as you can see by the project that I'm holding up, the Moby sweater by PetiteKnit, I went with the latter, so option B. This project is really fun for me, but it's a little bit bittersweet in a sense that I have reknit this sweater, or what you see here, about 6 or 7 times. I know I've knit the back panel at least 6 times. I think I'm on to like 8 times by now. And that's simply because I am a glutton for punishment. So to begin with, the yarn itself is a different weight than what PetiteKnit recommends. I think she recommended like an Aran weight, if I'm not mistaken. I could be, but whatever. Versus this yarn says it's a DK, but it's pretty light DK. So I'm choosing to knit this sweater on 3.75 needles. Originally 3.5 needles, hence the reason why I reknit the back panel maybe a couple times, but I ultimately settled on 3.5 millimeter needles. And overall, as you can see, I'm actually thinking that my hypothesis was correct. Because this is so textured, from far away, the yarn is actually looking better than the stockinette swatch that I had shown you guys previously. So I do have to say, knitting this up to a bigger size has really affirmed my choice. But because my gauge is so off, that's the reason why I've had to re-knit things a couple of times just to explore what that right count was going to be. So case in point here is this is one of the very first iterations. I got all the way to knitting the neck, but it's very clear to me that because my gauge was off and I didn't do my knitting mats properly, my neck hole was just too small. It came all the way up here, so I had to go back to the drawing board. So that's piece number one. The gauge was completely off. Had to do a lot of, knitting mats, kind of rushed my knitting mats. So as a result, probably knitted up one too many times. The next modification I made, I think you could actually see it in the previous video, but I don't know how much I talked about it. But I essentially have knit this to be a modified saddle shoulder. So to start with, when I first looked at the photos from other projects on Ravelry, there is one thing that just stuck out to me, and it's the fact that I do not like having a continuous panel. I forget whether this is moss stitch or seed stitch. I always get the two mixed up, but having this moss stitch, seed stitch pattern continue all the way up here, and to have this panel just start from, or this cable start from nothing, that really, really bothered me. So what I did is essentially created this saddle and brought this cable all the way up to meet with the other ladder sandwich cable. And as a result of this took a bit of trial and error because I was essentially trying to figure out the right placement along the shoulder, whether it would be here, whether it would be here, and so on and so forth. And I think I landed on a really nice place, which has the cable almost riding along the apex of your shoulder. So I think it looks really nice. And so because of that, that's the reason why I knit this up multiple times. And then the other thing is, I'm now at this weird point simply because I'm looking at the remaining yarn I have left, and this is how much I have left, and it's just very obvious to me, or at least I don't know if it is obvious to me, but my hypothesis is that I am going to lose yarn chicken. So this is a huge appeal to my viewer base. I know that you guys are small, but you are very mighty. So if anyone has a spare quantity of Fibre Co, the Fibre Co, the yarn is called Oops Blend number 1 in gray. If anyone has any sort of scraps, please do let me know because I'd love to finish it. At the moment, this is just to the side for two reasons. Number one, so I can show you the most interesting thing about this project, which is related to cables. And then also, it's a little disheartening because I strongly believe I just won't have enough yarn. So the most important reason for why I haven't frogged this, to be able to understand whether or not I have enough yarn, is because of you guys. So I wanted to share a little bit of trial and error with you guys, so I couldn't frog this just yet. And this has something to do with cables. So if anyone has ever knit cables and you just notice that the cables aren't coming out as crispy as you want them to, this is probably advice that I think no one has ever really posted about, but it's the concept of converting your cable into a high relief cable. So let me first start by showing you a few more glimpses or pictures of evidence of the problem, basically. So as you can see here, these cables just don't look crispy. And this is what I would like to call, I don't know if this is what it's called, but I'd like to call it a collapsed cable. So as you can see here, there's just an accumulation of fabric here that just makes the cable seem saggy. It doesn't have that punchiness of one clear portion coming into the foreground and one clear, part of the cable going into the background. It just looks a bit messy. And now, perhaps my hubris, but I do think I have a fairly consistent tension. I'm by no means a beginner knitter. In fact, I'm a tech editor and I've been knitting for a while. And so when I first came across this, I found it more prevalent when I was knitting with plant-based yarns as opposed to animal fibers. And that's simply because animal fibers have a sense of there's a loftiness there, and also what other folks deem as memory. when there's a roundness to your yarn, you rarely get this issue. But as I mentioned before, because of the fiber content, at least that's my hypothesis, and this sort of strand texture, it's not as conducive to holding a good cable just because it's not as round. There's texture here, so it's not that plump sort of tubular type of yarn. So I kind of anticipated this would be the issue. It took me a while to kind of just scrap it, and part of me did want to basically knit up a swatch. I would actually argue this is my swatch because I knew it was going to fail from the onset, but I just wanted to knit up enough to basically test out a few of my experiments, as I mentioned before. But now let me talk about the resolution. And I'd like to, I don't know where this has come from, but high relief cables is a term that I've definitely heard about floating out there, but I don't know if it's come from Elizabeth Zimmerman or any of those like knitting goddesses out there. But what high relief cables are essentially, it's the addition, it's adding purl columns to basically use the profile of a knit purl to push the knit stitches into the foreground. So I'll pause here and kind of just reflect on when you are knitting one by one rib. You will hopefully, if your knitting is quite neat, notice the knit stitches are the one that are pushed into the foreground because of the nature and the construction of the purl, it just fades into the back. And so if we use that similar principle and apply it to cables, we can essentially modify a cable that is collapsed into something that looks a little bit neat. So let me just show you what this looks like up close. And hopefully, I mean, it'd be a little bit awkward if you disagree, but hopefully you'll see here that the cables are a lot more neat and a lot more well-defined. And that's simply because, let me take a step back, kind of find a good one to stretch out, or actually any of them really. So as you can see, when I stretch out the fabric, there's a purl, there's a set of 2 purl stitches in the middle here. So essentially what you are doing is, if you had, I'm just going to use an example, I'm not saying that this is what the sequence is in the pattern because it's a paid for pattern, but let's just say PetiteKnit asked you to knit a 3x3 cable. Essentially, and you're experiencing a collapsed cable with the 3x3 cable. If you wanted to modify it to be a high relief cable, all you need to do is you need to add 2 purl stitches in the middle here. So essentially what would be written in the pattern is it's a purl or a sequence of purls followed by your 3 knit stitches. And then what you would do is you would add a purl, 3 of your knit stitches, and then it would be the purls as written per pattern. So what you would have is previously a 3x3 and you'd cross over. But now when you have the high relief technique, you're actually converting the 3x3 cable into a 5x5 cable, and you're crossing the 5x5. The only difference here is that the 2 stitches at the edge of your 5x5 cable, they're going to be purls. So that means you'll still have these 3 knit stitches as part of your cable in the foreground. The thing to be mindful of when you are making this change is because you're adding purl stitches that might change, let's just say, stitch counts for a collar. Let's just use that as an example. So if you're knitting a 2x2 rib collar, just be cognizant about how many stitches you're adding and making sure that stitch count is going to work favorably with the other elements in your sweater or in your garment. And so before I move on though, I think this is most easily seen on the inside of the garment. And actually that reminds me, what I want to start doing is actually showing you the inside of my work, because I think that if you have a really beautiful, neat inside, it just highlights the quality of the construction and of course the quality of the techniques that you're employing. So I'm going to start doing that from now on. Also, it kind of exposes yourself whether or not you're weaving in your ends, but I don't really care. I don't really weave in all my ends. Here we go. So let me first start by showing you the wrong side of a regular cable. So these are my collapsed cables, or as it's written in the pattern. And as you can see there basically is 2 columns of knits, which on the right side appear as purls, followed by your cabled section of purls, which on the correct side appears as a knit, and then flanked by the other knit stitches here, which on the right side appear as a purl. Now this is what a high relief cable looks like on the wrong side. So you have that same kind of knit column flanking structure. So here is the 2 knit columns, there's the 2 knit columns. But if you look closely, and bear in mind maybe this yarn isn't the best way of showcasing it because it's got a lot of texture to it, but hopefully you can see that there are 2 knit stitch ridges here. And once again, those knit stitch ridges appear as purls on the right side of the fabric, and those are essentially the added stitches that you are, adding onto your garment or your stitch count to make that high relief cable there. And in case you can't see and I'll review the footage, I'll put a picture of a side-by-side comparison in case you wanted to take a look at it. But the other reason why I want to show you the back is because just bear in mind here that you are also going to be cabling the purl stitches. So remember, to convert a 3x3 as an example, you have to add purl stitches and then you are going to basically cable a 5x5 cable. And I think that is probably the biggest lesson learned from this garment. It's been a while since I've had to convert a regular cable to a high relief cable, but I thought this was like the perfect opportunity. So now that we've gone through what I wanted to say and share with you guys on this project, I could probably continue knitting on and frog that, random bit of work that needed to be frogged. So as a result, because I just didn't want to touch this project, I cast on another project, which you guys have not seen because I had no intentions of making this from the last podcast. But this is my next project that is so close to being finished. And in order for me to finish it, I'm going to ask you guys for help with a design choice at the very end of this segment. But this right here is the Chantal sweater and it's designed by Moreca Knit. And before I even launch into any details, I do have to say and give huge praise to Moreca Knit. I just think in terms of her pattern, writing style, clarity, even formatting, superb. In terms of her design eye and aesthetic, I think I really respond to it. I would actually argue that her portfolio, if I could summarize it, it's very sophisticated, elegant, and I think that this sweater is a case in point for that. So the Chantal sweater is effectively a saddle shoulder sweater knit in a slip stitch pattern. And that slip stitch is actually that same slip stitch that a lot of us use in terms of a heel flap and gusset construction when you are working that heel flap and a slip stitch heel. That's the same pattern that you're using here. And I think from a design perspective, it is just so intricate that it just exudes that sort of, luxurious feel. Just because from far away, it does look like a little bit, it resembles a rib. But then when you get closer, it's really beautiful. You can see almost these like little mini knit stitches that you didn't quite see before. And while typically, and I know for sure the pattern calls for a heavier, like a different gauge weight, yarn weight to what I used. I think it calls for either a DK or maybe even a worsted, because I believe it calls for fingering plus a mohair held together in an all-around just looser fabric. I decided to be a bit of a glutton for punishment because just like the brioche that I talked about here, the slip stitch pattern is a 2-row repeat. So effectively for every 2 rows, you're knitting a segment or a length that is shorter than just a standard stockinette. And to make matters worse, I decided to actually knit it in a fingering weight yarn. So I sized the weight of the yarn to a lighter weight yarn. And in so doing, I actually ended up sizing my needle size down to, I believe, a 3.75 millimeter needle. So this here took ages to knit, but I have enjoyed every step of the way. And part of the reason why I really enjoyed it is number one, those construction details that I mentioned that Moreca is so good at. So just to highlight one, I'm pretty sure many people have mentioned, but your saddles aren't just a regular rectangle. I have a better image to show because I knit about like 7 gauge swatches and I use the saddles as my gauge swatch. But from those photos, but hopefully kind of what you can see here, it's a bit of a trapezoidal shape. And that is really nice because it just shows that she pays attention to the human body, where you'll probably need a bit more length in the back to kind of allow the sweater to drape over your scapula area a little bit more. So it's not just like that standard rectangle, because none of us are Lego people. It's very clear she's designed with intent, and also with that thought behind thinking about the human body and how it lays on the form. So huge call out there. I do have to say, I do not actually think this pattern is for beginners. And the reason why I say that is because this pattern, in order for you to get, at least in my mind, in order for one to get a product that they would like, it requires consistency between a right side working of the pattern and a wrong side working of the pattern. And so in my mind, at the beginner level, you're still trying to navigate, even tension. You'll probably experience a decent amount of rowing out. And so for me, it's really graduating from a beginner to a more moderate level. It's really when you figure out how to knit stockinette with a very even tension. And that sort of skill set translates here. So my word of caution to you, if you do want to actually knit this up, please knit both of the saddles and block both of the saddles, because the way that this fabric looks knit up versus blocked is incredibly different. So if you look at both of your saddles pre and post blocking, specifically the post blocking, and you're happy with how even they are, that's kind of your green light to go. And now the reason why I say this is because I forget which saddle it is. I believe it's the right side saddle. It requires you, in order to knit this trapezoid shape, or at least Moreca Knits instructs you how to knit the slip stitch pattern using the wrong side method. So effectively, across this sweater, and the reason why I recommend you do that step first is because while you are shaping the yoke of the sweater, you are going to employ both techniques, the wrong side technique and the right side technique. And I've tried, wearing my tech editor hat to figure out, ways to get around it. I honestly think the way that Moreca Knit has written it up, it's the right way of going around it, and you really can't avoid it. And so there's a reason why perhaps from far away this might look a little bit lumpy, and it's because I purposely did not want to block it for you guys as my audience, just to show you the difference in terms of what it looks like worked right side method versus wrong side method. And bearing in mind too, I do have to say, I'm pretty confident in my ability to have a very even stitch tension. And so I don't know if you can see it, but at the sleeve cap, you have to employ both methods. Now, on one side, I use the wrong side method, and on one side, I use the right side method. And I think you can kind of see where I make the switch in the technique, because one side, it's a little bit more three-dimensional, and that knit that you're slipping is just protruding out a little bit more. But this is all to say, please block your swatches specifically for this pattern, because the way that in the blocking process, your fabric will just relax, smoothing out some of those ridges that I mentioned before, and hopefully your right side and wrong side method will just cohesively just blend together, so no one's gonna see the difference in the technique that you used. So that's kind of why I didn't block this before, or that is why I didn't block this before showing you guys on the internet. Now, I'm just trying to think of any other points of caution. And it's really interesting because I've made almost no modifications, or at least construction related modifications, which to me reflects that, the pattern is really well structured from a technique and just overall approach. So yeah, once again, hats off. From a design perspective, I'm just trying to think. Okay, yes, I did actually make one construction modification, and it's not anything, major, but Moreca Knits does have you have your beginning of round, set your beginning of round at the center back. I would actually highly encourage anyone knitting this sweater to move that beginning of round to the beginning of your back panel. This way you're actually going to minimize the need, or actually altogether avoid the need to use the wrong side method for a huge, portion of your back panel. You could actually just avoid it outright. Because I think she has you working at the beginning of round, which means half of your back panel is going to be worked in the wrong side method, and then half of your back panel is going to be worked in the right side method. So just by moving that marker, you can just work right side and you are off to the races. And from a design modification perspective, so overall, like, love the design. Like, let's be very clear. Really enjoyed, despite this being a slog, working on this pattern too, because the yarn is beautiful, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But Moreca Knits essentially has you edge out the bottom of your sleeves and body with just a really small portion of, I think it's like 1 inch of ribbing. Because I didn't want that ribbing to cinch in, I actually opted to use, or to work, a fisherman's rib, and I sized my needles way down. Like, I sized my needles, I think, to a 2.25, but effectively, it still creates this really lovely rib because it's still a fisherman's rib, but there's a little bit more like heft to that rib, and I just really like, from a design perspective, how that's turning out. So it's really nice. So feel free to play with your ribs. Don't just use a 1x1. Feel free to use brioche or fisherman's rib, because it looks really refined, and I like it, because not everyone's rib is really clean, but sometimes if you convert it to a fisherman's rib, you can avoid some of those wonky rib issues. And then lastly, and perhaps the piece that I get most jazzed up about, is the yarn selection here. So I love the color of this yarn, and I've already checked the footage. I don't even think the value of the color is coming through in what it looks like in real life. It is so vibrant yet subdued at the same time. This is like a truly emerald green. So I've got an emerald engagement ring, and when I look at this green, it is just so reminiscent, and maybe that's why I kind of have the fondness for it, just because it's linked to really nice, memories for me. But this green is so rich, but yet it's not a full-on bottle green, because bottle green is too cool tone. But yet at the same time, it's nothing like a Kelly green, but it has the vibrancy of the Kelly green, but it's just so dark. I don't know. I am just obsessed with this color. And I sourced this yarn off of my favorite place, which is Facebook Marketplace. And I bought 9 50-gram skeins for £7, a total of £7. And with 4 pounds of shipping, this sweater in total will end up costing me £11. It is 100% merino, and I don't even think I have any of the ball bands left. Let me just go check. Give me a brief moment. So no, sadly, I don't have any of the ball bands left. I think I just tossed them, but from memory, I believe this yarn is the Yarn Works Merino 4-ply. So this is 100% merino yarn. And it is, I did not hold it with anything, mind you, as well. It's just the single strand of fingering weight yarn. From first blush, it does pill a little bit. I have yet to run my shaver across the sweater. I'm just waiting to block it, and then I'll go ahead and do that. But sometimes with merino, it needs that first shed, and then you get a true sense of its pill profile and its shed profile. So stay tuned. It'd be a real shame if this shed like crazy, but then that might be case in point for really investing the time and the cash to hold this with a mohair. I do quite like, though, my choice to size down. I actually think it amps up the elegance on this sweater ever so slightly more. So we'll see. And the reason why I didn't finish this sweater, and I wanted to hold off to talk to you guys, is essentially because I'd love to finish this with a 2x2 like varsity collar, I'm calling it. I don't know if that's what they're called, but it's essentially a collar where there is two very thin lines in a contrast color, and I can't figure out what color I would like to contrast this beautiful green with. So I've gone ahead and I've like mocked up some photos. Granted, I'm not the best with photo, I forgot what the software, Procreate, so the sweater color isn't like true to color, so I'm hoping that, through the video you can actually see. But I created those images to allow you to, just kind of help me out there, but this is what the yarns look like in real life. So this right here is an off-white Sandnes Garn tin Peer Gynt. This is leftovers from my porcelain sweater, which I do have to make a video about, so that's going to come up at some point. And that is kind of just a really traditional color match, that white with that green. But then when I was thinking about it, I saw this from a sweater that I have just in timeout because the pattern I did not like, and then I just put it to one side. But this is the Eden Cotton Yarns. This is a finger weight yarn. It's the Boland 4-ply in the colorway Calamondin. Don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but it's 100% blue faced luster, which I love. I love BFL. But this yarn is this like, it's like a luscious lime. It's like, it's more than just yellow, but with green tints in it, but it's not quite lime. I don't know how to describe it really, but this one is a bit more of like a funkier match, but given the contrast lines of that varsity color is so thin, I just thought this would be a little bit fun, or like more fun, but you know, I don't know. I haven't really made up my mind yet, so please help me out. I'm asking pretty much everyone I know, including you guys on the internet. So very happy to take feedback on that piece there. So that is whip number 2, the Chantal sweater by Moreca Knit. That brings us on to whip number 3. So because I didn't want to advance too far on this, I was like, okay. Sorry, that's my dog. So because I didn't want to advance too far on the Aussie, down, quiet. So because I didn't want to advance too far on the Chantal sweater without your feedback, I had to cast on another item to get my, fingers moving on another project. And that's what brings me to this guy right here. So let me start by actually talking about the yarn, because the yarn very much dictates, the pattern I chose, etc., etc. So the yarn I'm using is the Lotus Yarns Cashmere DK. And I bought this on eBay. Ooh, let me go through the color. Okay, so this is color number 51. And this color is so cool. So initially, like I said before, I bought this yarn on eBay. I think it was 35 pounds in total, so 7 pounds per skein. I bought a total of 5 skeins. When I first received this color through the mail, I didn't love it. There's something about it where I was just like, didn't really respond to it. And then out of need, I was like, ooh, okay, I need to cast something on. And I just started swatching. And I was swatching outside. And then by the time I, was done doing whatever I was doing at the house, I came in and I took a look at my swatch and the color transformed. This is one of the coolest colors. I shouldn't use the word cool actually, because I'll get into that in a little bit. It's one of the most intriguing colors that I've ever worked with. So outside of direct sunlight, this is like a really cool toned sage, almost like the Cotswoldsy sort of sage that you see if you've ever been to that neck of the woods in the UK. It's just a really lovely neutral greeny color. The moment though that the sunlight hits this yarn, what traditionally or what used to be like a cooler, color profile, all of a sudden just takes on like a really warm hue. It's nothing as strong as like a spring green, but it is just so cool how this yarn has transitioned from cool to warm. And I'll hark back onto like my previous video where I talked about neutrals, but in this particular case, this is the most neutral of green that I could ever describe. It works in both contexts, both a cool tone and a warm tone context, and I was like, that's really awesome. So the more I've worked with it, the more I've really enjoyed it, or working with it, as you can see, and I'll get on to why this is such a mess, but yarn hanging everywhere. But this yarn is just a pleasure to work with, not just the color, but the actual yarn itself. So my hypothesis is actually that this, yes, it is 100% cashmere, so it has a lovely hand feel, But more than that, I think the staple lengths on this are really, really long. And as a result, like I'm not getting any shedding. And bear in mind, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but I have actually knit a full garment up and then I've frogged it all. And hence the reason why I've got this like, you know, noodle soupy sort of mess right there. But even through that knitting process and frogging process, the yarn still looks brand spanking new. And just to kind of prove my hypothesis, and I wish I had taken photos of it, I just took a really short length of yarn, of fiber, and I used my dog's like slicker brush on it. It is so true. The fiber lengths were just really, really long. And I think it's just a testament to say, you know, try exploring other brands out there. I was just so pleasantly surprised, and I probably would have never come across this yarn without, you know, just happening to access a page on a listing on eBay. And so it's just really cool. So have some fun, go out, don't just stick with the bigger brands, you know, do it. And so now let me get on to why I chose this pattern, I guess, because that was a little bit of a saga in and of itself. So as I mentioned before, I only purchased 5 skeins, which results in, I think it yields like 900 meters. And yeah, it was actually really quite hard to find a pattern that was suitable for that yardage, or that meterage, simply because this is cashmere. I just wanted to use all of the yarn. I didn't want to have this weird stub amount to make mittens or to make hats, just because hats and accessories like that, they're just a lot more high traffic, and with like luxurious yarn like this, I just didn't want to use this on that. So initially I had my eye on the Maggie vest and the Paul vest, because I thought both, especially with this green, would translate really nicely into like a modern looking garment, especially like imagine it with, you know, a really punchy dark button, like a really dark tortoiseshell or like a really dark ebony button. I think that looks so good. But the unfortunate part about those pieces were that it would require maybe like 650, 700 meters, leaving me with a whole skein left. And I was like, I don't want that. So then I diverted my attention to cardigans. I think at that time I was just like, you know, whatever. I picked up a sock instead. And I think the algorithms know exactly what I'm searching for, because at some point I was commuting to work, taking a look at my phone, and I came across an Altazura cardigan that was almost, the color was so similar to this color, albeit it didn't have, I would actually argue that that cardigan, the color is less beautiful, or less my taste, I'll put it that way. But it just kind of sparked that bit of inspiration to say, you know what, this would be really, really great for a cardigan with very little positive ease. And actually I'll show you the image of the Altazura cardigan, because there's a finishing on that I really, really like, that I'm probably going to replicate here. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I wasn't fully convinced. And then once again, the algorithms know exactly who I am, because in that same journey home, they fed me another image of, and I think it's a Maison Margiela cardigan. And I think that cemented it for me. I was like, yep, absolutely gonna knit a cardigan. That's what this yarn was destined to be. And then the final cardigan that really, you know, made me think, yeah, I need to go out and source those kind of buttons, but I haven't come across them yet, is I then went looking actively for green cardigans, and I came across this Gucci cardigan with some really cute floral buttons. I'd love to find the same sort of floral buttons, ideally in an all natural material, but if anyone knows where to source those, please let me know, because I know I will need them in the very, very near future. But all this to say, when I had those 3 photos of, you know, that commercial inspiration, I then went back. I had exactly what I wanted to knit up in my mind, and I went back to Ravelry to try to find the right pattern. And also did a bit of project exploring just to triple check whether or not my meterage would get me as far as I think it would. Basically, would I lose at Yarn Chicken or not? So When I went back to Ravelry, I think I was toying between a few cardigans, and I'll put the images somewhere either here or here. And oh, I think that was it. I think I was debating between the April cardigan by PetiteKnit, the Copenhagen cardigan by PetiteKnit, and then the Maggie cardigan by PetiteKnit. All happened to be by PetiteKnit. And then there are a few other options that I was contemplating. I just can't bring them to memory right now. But I ultimately settled on the Maggie cardigan simply because, number one, I liked that crew neck sort of collar rather than the V, so that kind of removed the April cardigan from my list, because I feel like that's really on trend. I don't typically knit to trends, but I feel like that looks really modern. And I picked the Maggie over and above any other cardigan because if I did lose at Yarn Chicken, I knew that I had the bones to basically convert it back to a vest if I so needed. So that solidified my choice. So this here is a Maggie cardigan. And the first thing you'll note actually is, whoa, it doesn't actually look like a cardigan. It just looks like a sweater. And that is because I will be steeking it. So I will be doing a bit of a more complex steek than a standard steek. I'll be doing like a decorative steek to recreate the same white top stitching that you see in the, I don't know where I'll put the image, but in the Altazura cardigan. Whether or not I'll release a video about that is a whole nother thing, because that's a whole skill set that I don't possess, but you know, depending on feedback, if the desire is there, we'll see how whether I get to it. But the way that you convert any cardigan pattern to a steek is basically when you're at the part of, you know, knitting the front panels, instead of knitting those panels separately, you can effectively just backwards loop cast on a gutter. In this particular case, I'm using a gutter of 7 stitches because I need a little bit more length to do, or excuse me, a little bit more width to do the decorative steek that I'm mentioning. Whoa, I'm actually getting ahead of myself. Let me just do a quick overview of the pattern. Once again, because I always knit everything off gauge, you know, I'll just link the pattern for you to see those technical bits, because at the end of the day, I just change everything, so I don't have anything committed to memory. But effectively, the Maggie cardigan is a European tailored or English tailored construction. I flip-flop between the two, I forget which one it is. I think a lot of folks on the internet call it contiguous construction. Don't know how I feel about that name, but either way. And the way that you knit this up is effectively you knit that trapezoidal back. That trapezoid is created using a series of increases. When you are at a specified depth of that back panel, you will then pick up for the front panel, both the front left and front right panel. When you get to approximately this point here, and you can actually see the transition in my cardigan, especially if you're close up, you then go ahead and pick up along the piece that you just knit and connect such that you're creating a flat panel. Obviously, I am knitting in the round because I've decided to close my garment together, but eventually after increasing for the neck hole, I chose to connect in the round and to continue knitting in the round. And I guess the benefit there too is that you don't have to knit a cardigan using knits and purls. By knitting in the round, you could just do a continuous knit. And then the other thing that might be of interest to you, yes, just about steeking in general. I would actually argue, if you are thinking about approaching a steek, do a steek on a non-color work piece that you're working on. So one of my most popular projects on Ravelry is the porcelain sweater, and there in that project page I give pretty detailed written instructions, albeit it's probably not very eloquent, but you know, pretty detailed written instructions. And I do have to say it's a bit higher risk when you are steeking with color work, because you're having to manage those floats versus when you are steeking with a single color. Let's just say, for instance, you mess something up and it's made of entirely natural fibers. It's not ideal, but theoretically you could salvage the portions that you cut by just splicing them together. But anyway, you know, cautionary tale there, but feel free to stay tuned as I go ahead and, you know, potentially walk you through what I did on my steek. There's only two other reflections I kind of want to talk about when it comes to this garment. The first of which, and perhaps a little bit controversial, I don't know how much I love the European tailored shoulder, the English tailored shoulder, just because the best way that I've seen to bring all of your pieces in the round, because you're working your shoulder cap or your sleeve cap at the same time, the best way to bring your front panel and connect it to that shoulder sleeve, or to start to create that shoulder cap, excuse me, it works something really funny. It almost creates this like 3-dimensional bump here, which I know it's the smallest of things. It just kind of bugs me. We'll see whether or not it bugs me to the extent that I write off this construction for me altogether, but we'll wait and see. Hopefully it doesn't bother me too much, and hopefully with wear it just flattens out a little bit, but that's my one niggle there. And then the other elephant in the room is the fact that, yeah, I consistently knit and frog things. This project is no exception. So I have actually knit this entire garment before, just without the steeking portion, or pretty much the entire garment. So I knit all the sleeves, I knit all the body, because this was my holiday project. As a side note or tangent, that's just another testament to the quality of the yarn. This has been through travel. So lots of opportunity for friction, and still it looks brilliant. But getting back to the story, so because I was traveling with it, you know, I didn't have my barber cords with me. I just didn't have the opportunity to properly try it on. And I made the grave mistake of just not getting my knitting maths right. And I knit my sleeve too thin, so I didn't have enough positive ease there. I had enough, but it just visually and from a comfort perspective, it wasn't it for me. And so because this is a English shoulder construction garment where you actually begin to increase at the sleeve all the way through, effectively almost like a pseudo raglan, in order for me to add width to my sleeve, I had to frog it all the way back up to somewhere around here. So I had a whole garment, and I just, you know, frogged it all the way up here. And hence the reason why, and this is only part of my yarn, I just have so much of this, you know, loopy soupy yarn here that I have to process. And so this kind of brings me on to my fourth whip. The next cast on has everything to do with the yarn, because I think the yarn is just so cool. And my next cast on is a Fjaere Genser, a backward engineered Fjaere Genser, and it's knit up in Snailden 5-ply. So Snailden is a Faroese yarn from the Faroe Islands, and it just has a really cool, like it's such an intriguing dryness. It is rustic, but at the same time, I don't feel like there's any harshness on my skin, because I think that's just because there's no overt like guard fibers, you know, like other, you know, fibers out there. So it's really pleasant on the skin, despite it being so rustic. And then the other thing to note too is that the Snailden 5-ply is a true, I would argue, bulky weight yarn. Like this swatch here, this is actually post-blocked. This gives me a 15 stitch gauge for 10 centimeters. But the reason why I want to call this out is because I've actually worked with a merino bulky in the past with a similar stitch gauge across. And that yarn just yielded a fabric that was just so much heavier. This is such a joy because of it. It's just so lofty. It's light. It's almost like working with Nutidin without holding it with another yarn, without like pulling it to its full tautness. It has that airiness. And so I was able to source 600 skeins of Snailden on Facebook Marketplace. So that in total is, I think it was 6 skeins of Snailden for 25 pounds, which was great. And I have 4 white and 2 black. And the point to note about the black too, for anyone who wants to source Snailden, is that this color is so interesting. It's a natural black, which is even more cool. So no dyes going into that, at least to my knowledge from what I can research. But when you actually see it in person, The black is the deepest shade of brown. And when you look at it in the sunlight, that brown almost has like a mahogany tint to it. But from far away, it definitely looks like a true black. So there's some really interesting characteristics to this yarn. And I guess the reason why I pulled the trigger so quickly on it is just because when will I ever go to the Faroe Islands? So when will I ever have the opportunity to feel it, to, knit with it? And so I just jumped at the opportunity. So this is a really exciting project. I can't wait. So as I mentioned, I am knitting up the Fjaere Genser, and the Fjaere Genser is a pattern by Rauma Garn, and that pattern can be found in booklet 425. And as you can see, I have no booklet. So essentially, in order to buy, I couldn't source it anywhere, but in order to actually get the booklet, you need to buy a minimum quantity of yarn, I believe, from Rauma Garn. And as we all know, as I've said many a time, that's just not my preferred method of acquiring yarn. So all this to say is that I'm essentially backwards engineering this sweater, and it's actually going to be quite straightforward just because it is a raglan. I do have a special calculator that helps me figure out, at this point of the body, if this is my total stitch count, how many stitches should I cast on for my neck edge. I'm not sure if I want to release that as a tool or anything because it requires me to clean it up a little bit. But it's just a really cool calculator that hasn't failed me just yet. And just case in point, I'm now working my third row of the color work pattern. And I did the maths and the maths are mathing and I'm gonna be just fine. So I should be all good in terms of recreating the Fjaere Genser there. The other thing I want to note too is that it brings up an interesting piece when I talk about that calculator, because in that calculator I give the option to myself to figure out how many short rows I want, and perhaps I'll go off into a tangent, maybe I'll edit it out, but I do have to say that there is an obsession with short rows when it comes to good fit, and that's not the rule. It's not one size fits all. Short rows are a tactic amongst many other techniques that you can employ to get a better fitting garment. But the reason why I've opted for short rows here is simply because you just have less forgiveness when you're working with a bulky weight yarn. So when you're working with something like a fingering weight yarn, maybe your row gauge is like 44 stitches or 44 rows. That's the case for the Chantal sweater. So in those 44 rows, you have a lot more control to be able to shape the garment or shape the panel or what have you into whatever you need. But especially when you're working in bulky weight, that's why I think that, don't try not to strive for anything that is too form-fitting, because it's just harder. It's gonna be 10 times harder because on this garment, I forget what my row gauge is, I'm definitely not gonna have as many rows per inch as something like this. And so that margin of forgiveness, bearing in mind that I have 15 stitches per 10 centimeter width, it's just going to be harder to get the desired exact dimensions of a panel I want. So everything has to be approximated a little bit more. So that's a long-winded way of saying, because I know I wanted a certain profile of my neck, I didn't want my neck tight, but nor did I want my neck, all the way out here. So as a result, because I tend to have my shoulders are very perpendicular to my neck, I have very, strong shoulders here, I knew that I need to add as much width as I could as quickly as possible without adding depth. And so whenever I'm thinking about those two constraints, that's when I would naturally opt for using short rows to go ahead and think about shaping that upper portion of my yoke. The other thing I think that's interesting to call out is this decorative collar edge, because I think it just goes to show where if you have the right patience, or if you have enough patience to trial different techniques, like go do it. You're in such a low stakes portion of your project when you're first starting out, because if you mess up, you just frog this, which is like an inch worth of work. But this is all to say, I highly recommend two techniques by the knitting goddesses themselves, Patty Lyons and Suzanne Bryan. So for anyone that wants to get at, refining their knitting techniques, I think that one of the techniques that I have used and added to my arsenal is the Italian cast on. And I really, really like Suzanne Bryan's tutorial, which I'll link below, because it is not just the Italian cast on, but it gives you a neat edge because it's a provisional Italian cast on in the round. Because it's in the round, you don't really get a jog, and I think it's the best way of minimizing that jog. And because it's provisional, it gives you really clean stitches in lieu of something that's a little bit more spread out. I know provisional cast-ons aren't for everyone, but I do have to say it's the one technique that's really leveled up that Italian cast-on game across all my projects, and it's the only way that I do Italian cast-on now. So just try it, see if it works for you. The only build I have to that, just watching that video, is if you are working with a heavier gauge yarn, I would definitely size down a couple of needle sizes when you are doing the provisional Italian cast on in the round. Just by virtue of, just for example, I am knitting this on 6mm needles, and I cast on with my starting edge at 4.5mm needles. And I use those 4.5mm needles for the entire black portion. And then when I switched to my main color, I switched over to using my 6mm needle. And this is mostly a design decision because I didn't want my collar, because it's bulky weight yarn, I didn't want it to be skin tight. I did want it to feel a little bit more relaxed because personally, for preference reasons, I just don't want bulky weight yarn just stuck onto me. The other technique that I mentioned I think is worth taking note of is the Patty Lyons how to prevent jogs. Like, I'll link it below. But it's one that's always served to help me, and it's one that does require a little bit more trial and error because in some contexts it works and then some it doesn't. So the very first question that you should always ask yourself, I guess, when thinking about striping, and the reason why I bring this up is because the Olga sweater is super popular. Like, it's all over the TikTok, it's all over my Instagram, and so this is kind of a word to the wise for anyone thinking about the Olga sweater. The thicker your stripes, the less likely it is that you'll need to use a jogless technique. And that's simply because that stripe is so thick, so when you're looking at the contrast color versus the main color, because there's so much width there, your eye's not really going to notice that differential there. So when you get to really, really thin stripes, so this right here, what you're seeing is a 1 row contrast row. When you get to really thin stripes, then you probably should think about, maybe I should employ those techniques. And the Patty Lyons technique, hands down, is one of the best ways to go. The other thing I want to mention too is that this is a 1x1 rib, and I think 1x1 rib gives you a little bit more flexibility, because if you are doing a 1x1 rib with a specifically 1 row contrast color, my recommendation for you is to switch colors when you're working a purl stitch. And that's just by virtue of the fact that the purl stitch, we all know how a 1x1 rib lays. The knit is in front, the purl's in back. So when you do the color switching on that purl stitch, it is less obvious than when it is the knit stitch, which is the one that's going to be apparent to your eye. So that's just a little tip there. Ooh, and then the other bonus tip too is that when you are working probably a 1 row or a 2 row contrast row, when you are changing colors, feel free to just knit across the entire row. It won't change the characteristics of your fabric, don't worry, because you're not knit purling for 1 row. In fact, I would actually argue that it creates a cleaner 1x1 rib edge because you don't have the purl bump showing through on the right side of the fabric. Play around with it, feel free, use your scrap yarn. These are all the sorts of things that makes knitting super fun because you can just knit, and then undo it. So feel free, have a play around, and that's the only way you really learn. So that is the Fjaere Genser. If anyone else wants to backwards engineer it with me, I know I was watching a podcast, I even commented on that podcaster, like, hey, she had the same plan to redo it too, because she couldn't source the pattern. Like, I'm all for sharing techniques, especially, as a tech editor, I probably have some insights that not everybody has. So for anyone, whether it's the Fjaere Genser or just in general, backwards engineering patterns, we can definitely all help each other out. So that is the roundup. Because as you can see here, there are no summer garments, like there are no tank tops, there are no tees. This is all just to say, yeah, over the summer I tend to try to knit things that are darker in hue because I get more sunlight rather than in the winter when we get hardly any. But yeah, I do knit sweaters, and I think there was a YouTuber that made a video and it went down like a lead balloon about summer sweaters or something like that. And yeah, this is me kind of throwing my hat in the ring to say, you know what, girl, like I don't think you were all too wrong. I clearly knit sweaters in the summer. It's like the only thing I do. So this is all just to say this is what makes me happy. I just kind of go with the flow, whatever, brings me joy. So sometimes that does mean that I'm knitting a summer garment in the winter, but hopefully if you're interested in where I'm going, you stick along. But yeah, thanks for joining me on the ride. See you hopefully next time, and hopefully it is a bit sooner than how long it took me to produce this video. So thank you very much, and take care. Bye.